Hello, my name is Sophie Rain and I'm a PhD student in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. The aim of this session is to show how concerns over asylums in the mid-Victorian period influenced Wilkie Collins' sensation novel The Woman in White. More specifically, we're going to be looking at considering the idea of moral management of women and wrongful confinement. My own research looks at penny dreadfuls and periodicals, which were working class fiction around 1830 to 1865, and were printed cheaply in instalments. These texts were extremely popular, influential, and reflected social and political concerns at the time. The penny dreadful can be seen as laying the foundation for sensation fiction, and one of the issues these texts focus on was wrongful confinement. Since there is an overlap between the penny dreadful and early sensation fiction, they both exist in the same contextual framework, which I'm going to talk you through in this session. My approach to studying is a new historicist approach, which means that when I look at text, it is through a contextual lens, and argue that all texts are a product of the historical, social, or political landscape at the time. In this session, I will show you how looking at The Woman in White through this historical lens will help you to analyse the text in a more critical and creative way. This session will look at close reading examples of the text, as well as periodical press news reporting of asylums at the time, to establish how the asylum and the home are represented as sites of male control and female oppression. Firstly, it is important to make the distinction between public and private asylums. Public asylums were funded by the County Asylums Act in 1808 with the intention of removing mentally ill paupers from the workhouses. Later, pauper asylums began to be funded by individual local counties and parishes. Private asylums were funded by the families of the patient themselves and would cost around 15 shillings per week to be placed there, almost twice the amount of a public institution. There often was an overlap where pauper asylums would take in private patients if they had the space, but for this session we are going to be looking at the private asylum and middle class anxieties it evoked. For your first activity, I would like you to read the advertisement from Dr. Finch's asylum at Fisherton House and answer the following questions. What does the advertisement focus on and why is this significant? And what do you think about the advertising of asylums? And what does this reveal about mental illness and how it was viewed in the mid-Victorian period? Take some time to complete this activity now, pausing the recording and moving on to the next slide when you're done. You may have noticed that the advertisement focuses quite heavily on the facilities available and the space around the asylum, more so than the actual treatments. There is a focus on the idea of this being a luxury retreat, which seems peaceful and far removed from the image of the asylum as a place of confinement, abuse and poor living conditions. You may also have commented on the constant supervision of the patients, which makes this seem like a heavily regulated and perhaps even invasive place. The move to a more domestic setting further links the asylum with the home for women in the Victorian period. It may also seem rather surprising to a modern reader that asylums were monetised. These advertisements were often aimed at family members who perhaps would feel more reassured by this kind of sanitised advertisement. Mental illness was now focused on patient care, and while this was a far more humane approach, it also reveals the capitalist agenda of medical institutions at this time. The moral therapy approach is evidenced in the advertisement's emphasis on religious services happening every week, showing that mental illness was in some cases attributed to a lapse in spirituality or morality. Another reason why these advertisements focused on the serenity of the asylum was perhaps to draw attention away from the negative press surrounding private asylums and wrongful or forced confinement. The idea that the asylum was monetised, as shown through the amenities on offer throughout the advertisements on the previous slide, lends itself to the possibility of exploitation. Women could be legally incarcerated by their husbands or other male family members without consent. This opened up discussions as to how the system could be exploited by men to remove inconvenient wives or female relatives. The Woman in White is based on wrongful confinement cases of women, such as Louisa Nottage or Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, as well as debates surrounding women and property law. Issues of wrongful confinement had been present for some time with the formation of the alleged Lunatics' Friends Society in 1845, winning multiple cases. At the start of the 1860s, the focus was moving towards looking at how women were particular targets for wrongful confinement due to their lack of legal rights. Literary critic Elaine Showalter remarks upon the differences between male and female asylum patients. In particular, she notes that women had less recreational activity outdoors, as there was more focus on sewing and many women had made garments for the asylum. In addition to this, Victorian madwomen were subject to moral management of their appearance, and psychiatrists had strong views about how their patients should look. It is clear then that there is a strong connection between the asylum and the home in their function. In The Woman in White, Collins shows how the asylum system reflected the typical domestic space in terms of gendered power structures. This session will look at how Collins reveals parallels between the asylum and the home through control, observation, and infantilisation. Starting with the idea of observation, D.A. Miller argues that the novel represents discipline mainly in terms of certain general isolated effects on the disciplinary subject, whose sensationalised body both dramatises and facilitates its function as the subject-object of continual supervision. This constant supervision was a way of controlling asylum patients now that restraint and other abusive measures had been removed. This is explored in great depth by French philosopher Michel Foucault, who wrote in Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity at the Age of Reason, about the development from brutality in the asylum system to coercive control and surveillance. Foucault argues that the function of the asylum was to create docile and obedient patients through observation and surveillance. The movement from violence to coercive control in the asylum is also seen as taking place in the domestic space in The Woman in White. We can see this from Count Fosco when he speaks to Percival. He states that human ingenuity, my friend, has hitherto only discovered two ways in which a man can manage a woman. One way is to knock her down, a method largely adopted by the brutal lower orders of people, but utterly abhorrent to the refined and educated classes above them. The other way, much longer, much more difficult, but in the end not less certain, is never to accept provocation at a woman's hands. For this activity, reread this extract from Count Fosco and answer the following questions. What does Count Fosco's advice reveal about Victorian attitudes to marriage? And what does this focus on observation and surveillance suggest about both mental health care and marriage? Take some time to complete this activity now, moving on to the next slide when you're ready. Fosco's advice reveals that marriage in the 19th century was dictated by the husband, and the ideal wife was seen as passive and docile. This ideal Victorian wife is often referred to by critics as the angel of the house. Fosco is appalled at the concept of violence, not out of a moral sense, but because he feels it is for the lower classes and is ineffective. Instead, Fosco uses manipulation in order to control Madame Fosco. In the case of mental health care in the Victorian period, the move towards observation was a step in the right direction for humane care. However, the observing and monitoring of patients was just another form of disciplining and controlling them, according to Foucault. In relation to marriage, observation has a similar effect. Thus, Collins illustrates how both violence and coercive control can be used to discipline women into being obedient and docile. This lack of autonomy in patients and wives in the text reveals how the male-dominated institutions of marriage in the asylum were structured towards either containing or subjugating inconvenient women. The result of Fosco's oppression on his wife is seen in this extract, detailing how Madame Fosco has changed after marriage. For the common purposes of society, the extraordinary change thus produced in her is, beyond all doubt, a change for the better, seeing that it has transformed her into a civil, silent, unobtrusive woman who was never in the way. How far she has really reformed or deteriorated in her secret self is another question. I have once or twice seen sudden changes of expression on her pinched lips, and heard sudden inflections of tone in her calm voice, which have led me to suspect that her present state of suppression may have sealed up something dangerous in her nature, which used to evaporate harmlessly in the freedom of her former life. On this extract, answer the following questions. Does male control actually change the women, or just their outward behaviour? Underline any words and phrases to support your argument. What does Madame Fosco's performative domesticity reveal about women in Victorian society? And finally, the interior of the asylum and the interior of the Fosco home are never shown, but their effects on women are. What is the significance of this? Take some time to complete this activity, moving on to the next slide when you're ready. In this extract, we can see that the control of her husband does not appear to have fundamentally changed Madame Fosco, as she is often seen changing the inflection of her voice and resisting the urge to speak out. Her need to suppress her thoughts and control her tone show that she still has a remnant of rebellion, but is forced to present herself in a more socially acceptable way due to her husband's influence. Collins reveals that marriage, and therefore the asylum, does not necessarily transform women, but leaves them fearful of punishments for disobedience. Domestic life does not reform women either, but makes them more socially palatable and amenable. Madame Fosco performs her domestic role and is described as being never in the way, further linking the idea that home and the asylum was a way to contain women by limiting their mobility and restricting how much space they could occupy. This performative domesticity shows that women in Victorian society were limited in terms of their free speech. This can further be shown through their lack of suffrage or their influence in the public sphere. The reader never gains true insight into the methods of Fosco or the asylum. They are only shown the outcomes in the form of nervous and compliant women. The lack of transparency of the asylum was commented upon repeatedly in the press. Furthermore, many social investigators criticised the asylum inspections and were outraged at the limited supervision and lack of accountability of the medical practitioners who worked in these asylums. Despite being sensational fiction, Collins does not exploit the asylum for voyeuristic purposes, instead focusing on the institutional abuse that led to women being wrongfully confined. We are not shown inside the Fosco home and are left to imagine the methods used by Count Fosco to control his wife. This could again be to avoid unnecessary sensationalism, which would undermine the moral message that Wilkie Collins was trying to make. One of the other methods used to control women was through infantilisation. So just having a look at a quick contextual example. In 1858, Rosina Bulwer-Lytton was admitted to an asylum by her husband, Edward Bulwer-Lytton, who was a writer and politician, after she threatened to ruin his political career. Lady Bulwer-Lytton was only in confinement for 3 weeks, under the supervision of Dr. Hill. When she complained about her wrongful confinement and the other patients, Dr. Hill informed her that this was not an asylum, and that her and the numerous other patients were his children. Treating women and female patients as children further occurs in The Woman in White when Laura returns to her home. We can see Laura being treated as a child upon her return from the asylum, and she argues to Walter, "You work and get money, Walter, and Marion helps you. Why is there nothing I can do? You will end up liking Marion better than you like me, you will, because I am so helpless, or don't treat me like a child." So just answer this following question. How does the infantilisation of women in the novel act as a tool to control them? You can use this extract and then perhaps look at other extracts throughout the novel. Take some time to complete this question now, moving on to the next slide when you're ready. We can see here that even though Laura is now at home, the asylum has profoundly affected her. She feels a burden to her family and that she's been treated like a child. She's also not able to engage with others on the same level, which reminds Laura of her time in the asylum, where doctors and nursing staff would assume complete control over her daily life. By infantilising women, male relatives were able to control and potentially exploit them, by positing themselves to the authorities as a rational counterpart. Infantilisation also negates the voices of women and does not allow them to speak for themselves. As Laura protests at being wrongfully confined, her pleas are ignored, as she is seen as unreliable, due to both her certification and her gender. Victorian women were often treated as children throughout the legal system, which had restricted them from gaining suffrage and an education, which in turn fostered a culture of dependency on men. This restriction also limited their property and their financial rights. Collins here could be further commenting that these gendered marriage laws, shown in The Woman in White, were leaving women open to exploitation and abuse. These controls, reinforced by the legal system, were a way of ensuring that women remained confined, either metaphorically or literally, as the text reveals. Here are the image credits and the bibliography if you wish to do any further reading. Thank you for working through this session on women and confinement in The Woman in White. I hope this session has encouraged you to consider the multitude of ways that Wilkie Collins uses the space of the home and the asylum to reveal issues regarding institutionalised gender control. For further information about studying English literature at Lancaster University, please visit this link. Thank you very much.